Welcome to this presentation. We're going to talk about plotting the inciting incident and the first attempt. And by the first attempt, I mean the first attempt at solving the major dramatic question or the main conflict that you have in your story. The inciting incident. So there are different schools of thought on this. Some people like to have an inciting incident really near the beginning, to kind of hook the reader's interest. Some people delay it for a little bit. If you do choose to delay it, I would suggest having other sorts of smaller conflicts that lead up to the inciting incident. So there is some tension, there is some drama leading up to the one that shows you what the main conflict is. But that is completely up to you, depending on the nature of your story. This is where the reader finds out what the central conflict is. It's usually something pretty dramatic. My personal view is that it should occur pretty soon in the story so that we know what we're reading about. It should be interesting and exciting. Something interrupts the normal flow of your protagonist's life. They're walking down the street and they get hit by a car, or they come home and they find that their house has been broken into by robbers, or they, it doesn't have to be that dramatic. Sometimes it can be as simple as, Phil wakes up and goes to school, and there is a pretty new girl sitting next to him who just came into the school, and he's intrigued by her. Just something that piques the interest and sets up the stage for possible conflict to continue in the story. Now, there are different ways of doing a plot, but one of my favorite ways is called the try-fail cycle. And we typically, when we talk about the try-fail cycles, there's at least 3 that you're going to do. 3 times when the protagonist tries to overcome the problem, but fails. Only to rinse and repeat. And the name of the game here is escalation. They're going to try a little bit harder each time they fail to overcome the problem. But your first try-fail cycle, they don't necessarily try the biggest thing that's going to require the most effort. They try the very first thing that comes to your mind. For example, let's say you're writing a medieval fantasy, and the problem is that you've got a goblin army outside the walls, and you're sitting with the main character is the king, and he's trying to figure out what to do about this invading army who has besieged his castle. So the first try-fail cycle might be trying the diplomatic way. You might just try to go out and reason and talk with them. That doesn't take much effort, doesn't take much thought. They just kind of, we're going to try this. You never know, it might work. If you want to have an interesting story, it doesn't work. Because there need to be other aspects to the plot and the conflict. If you have too few cycles, if they just resolve their problem right away, it feels pretty unrealistic. Because most of the things that we struggle with in life require many attempts. Each try-fail cycle, you have to ramp up the tension or the suspense. There's 2 different ways that I like to talk about doing this. Deepening the conflict. If you make a conflict deeper, it affects more people more deeply. The stakes are higher. For example, if we're talking about our castle siege, we could say, the king is worried about his castle, but then he finds out that his daughter was out by the moat when the goblins came, and they've captured his daughter. And so if he doesn't defeat the goblins, he is going to lose the princess. It affects the king on a more personal level, more deeply. Broaden is taking the conflict and making it affect more people than it did before. Let's say the king sends out his messenger bird to the next castle over and says, "Hey, we need reinforcements, come help us." And it comes back and says, "Oh, I'm sorry, there's another huge goblin army here too. And we can't help you. We need help ourselves." So he finds out it's not just his castle, but the whole kingdom is under attack by ravenous goblins. Now that affects more people than it did before. And you can do either one of these, or you can do both. But either way, These things will heighten the tension in your readers and the suspense. Good way to get them to keep reading, to see how you resolve things. Now, the first try-fail cycle shouldn't last all that long. They try the first thing that comes to mind, so it shouldn't really take up more than the first little part of your story. The next tries are going to take up much more of it. Whatever happens at the end of the first try-fail cycle, it should launch you into the action of the second one. So, for example, they try the diplomatic approach, and as a result, it makes the goblins angry, and they start firing flaming arrows into the castle. So they kind of puts the pressure on them to think of something different there in the castle to try to resolve this conflict. So once you've reached the end of your first try-fail cycle, you've likely gone from the kind of the beginning part of your story where you're setting things up, introducing the characters, the conflict, and so forth, into what we call the middle of your story, the meat of them trying to solve the conflict in various ways.